A lot of the discussion surrounding this episode has been mainly focused on the heartfelt ending revolving around Subaru and Otto. But beyond that was a much more revealing turn of events. One that properly explains why exactly it was that Subaru was taken prisoner. Not only that, but there were also plenty of subtleties excluded from this episode that go towards further developing the greater mystery. Especially the parts with regards to Garfiel's sudden change in attitude, Beatrice's affiliation to the gospel, and Ryuzu's mysterious lookalike. So let's take a closer look at each of these as we go through what the anime left out from the novels. Let's get started. Episode 32, Friend, covering Chapter 2 to Chapter 4 of Volume 11 of the light novel. Starting in the Forbidden Library, the way Subaru had expressed his anger towards Beatrice was a little bit more violent than what we saw in the anime. His questions and pleas were all made as he held Beatrice's throat as if trying to choke her. This wasn't just because a new checkpoint could have been set though. Subaru also felt that Beatrice had just taken away the only thing that he was good for. By letting the opportunity to die get away from him, Subaru was now nothing more than the worthless person that he always made himself out to be. I mean, it was quite literally his only job to use his life as if it was expendable whenever it was necessary. And this was certainly one of those moments. But that was something that neither Beatrice nor anyone else would ever be able to understand. So when it became clear that she wasn't going to help him return by death, Subaru smashed the wooden stool that Beatrice was always using as her seat. He picked it up and threw it against the bookshelf so that he could use one of the sharp fragments to end his life. Had he completed the job, then it would have been the third time that he's done this, each of which marked a significant point throughout his lengthy journey, and each of which were all for different reasons. The first time was to try and fix something that couldn't be undone. The second was out of remorse so that he could try and save Rem after she'd been taken away from him. And this time it would have been due to his own personal resentment. Indignation that he felt towards himself for not being powerful enough to fulfill the only duty that he had. With not many options left, the only thing Subaru could think in this moment was how much he wanted to die. I mean, death was the only thing left that had any meaning. Once again though, Beatrice had intervened to take even that away from him. She was acting in a way that was far beyond his own comprehension. Subaru saw absolutely no reason for her to go to such lengths to stop him from dying. Because of this, there were so many questions that he wanted to ask, but he neither had the energy nor the understanding to do so. As he looked around in disarray, that's when he spotted the gospel. It's important to note that this book wasn't one that simply fell off the shelves. No, it was being kept hidden within the stool that Subaru had just destroyed. What this meant was that this book was something that Beatrice had been actively trying to hide. A fact that briefly made Subaru completely forget the horrible state that he found himself in. He now wanted to know why Beatrice had what was pretty much the witch cult's Bible. As he asked, he recalled what Betelgeuse had previously taught him about the gospel. How it was pretty much a sacred book that provided the reader with a bunch of prophecies. Prophecies that the witch cult felt that they had to follow to the letter. On the other hand, Beatrice made it clear that the reason she follows the gospel is because of a person she refers to as Mother. In fact, there was actually a line omitted from the anime where Beatrice states that her connection to Mother is everything, implying that the thing maintaining that connection was the gospel itself. Now, when Beatrice flat out denied the existence of any form of relationship between herself and Subaru, this was arguably what hurt him the most. I mean, throughout the entirety of Season 1, we were shown time and time again how Beatrice was the one person that Subaru could open up to. Back when his mind was on the verge of breaking, she was the only person that he could turn to help him bring himself back together. He truly felt that they were at least something akin to friends. But now Subaru knew that that was nothing more than a fantasy on his part. A top 10 anime betrayal, if you will. Subaru would have several of his limbs chopped off before finally awaking in the next loop. After realizing that everything wasn't lost, Subaru couldn't help but feel a significant amount of relief. Despite Amelia suffering through the trial right in front of him, there was a certain comfort that came from seeing it happen. Subaru knew that this was a practically insane point of view to have, but these were just the true feelings that he currently possessed at the moment. It was after he organized his thoughts that he finally decided to wake up Amelia. His plan of action was to take this next loop one event at a time. If he truly intended to save everyone, then he needed to figure out what the right sequence of events was. This was something that would only be possible by going through each situation as it unfolded. So, as he held Amelia in his arms with all these new feelings of determination, there was one very important thing that he didn't notice the entire time. His face was completely devoid of any emotion. Now, when he exited the tomb, Subaru noticed a few immediate changes to this loop in comparison to the previous one. Because he had been staring at Ram's face for an unusually long period of time, this prompted her to ask why that was. Of course, we know it's because of her fate from the previous loop. But since that was something that Subaru couldn't tell her, he simply said that it was because she had a pretty face, a statement that Ram found to be a bit unsettling. It was after this that Subaru would carry Amelia to her bedroom. For some reason, he felt it was the only thing that he could do as a man. I guess the previous loop really had him feeling pretty worthless. So this was yet another change to the timeline of events. Subaru then left Amelia with Ram while he prepped for his scheduled conversation with Roswaal. And this time he had plenty more questions that he wanted to ask, especially regarding Beatrice. If you remember in the last loop, this was a topic that Roswaal said he couldn't talk about yet. So this time Subaru wasn't going to let Roswaal avoid the question. As he thought about how he was going to approach the situation, Otto noticed that Subaru looked rather busy. He didn't just approach Subaru for being calm like how they said in the anime. It's also because Subaru wasn't paying Amelia the attention that he normally would. He even went so far as to directly tell Otto that he didn't have time to be worrying about her, which was the exact reason why Otto decided to ask him if he was alright. Something was clearly affecting his current mental state, something that took greater precedence than even Amelia. While this was likely still the after effects of the trauma from the previous loop, anyone who knew Subaru would be able to tell that something about him was off. The only person who couldn't was Subaru himself. When Garfiel entered the conversation shortly after, this was such an absurd shift in events that Subaru was convinced that each loop was a different Garfiel. Compared to the last two, his opinions and actions never really aligned. There was no distinguishable pattern that he seemed to follow. But as we'll soon find out, there's actually a more solid reason behind this change in behavior. In any case, the fact that he wanted to talk to Subaru meant that Otto couldn't be there. As he was now, Subaru still considered Otto to be an innocent bystander. He didn't want him to get caught up in their faction's affairs. His intentions with Otto were to always grant him his audience with Roswaal, then have him returned back to his normal life. Nothing more. He was always just this merchant that Subaru happened to save once, not really someone that Subaru could see as a friend. So Otto was a bit dejected that he'd been left out yet again, but there wasn't really anything that he could do to change that. Now, as Garfiel led Subaru through the Lost Woods, Subaru decided to see if he could get some answers about Frederica. During the last loop, because she had willingly chose to engage Elsa, Subaru was now convinced that she was an ally that could be trusted. So that meant someone else was pulling the strings, and this was what he was trying to find out. It was information that he would eventually get from Ryuzu. But before she told him about Frederica, Subaru found it to be a bit suspicious that Ryuzu and Garfiel would suddenly trust him. I mean, it had only been half a day since they'd met him, yet here they were sharing information as if he was part of their group. Not to mention that it was very odd that Ryuzu had changed her outfit between the time of their previous meeting and now. Anyway, Subaru would then go on to share his ideas so long as they promised not to tell anyone else about it. It was a pretty ironic situation considering that Subaru himself found things like promises difficult to uphold. But he went ahead and claimed that someone had recently taught him of their importance. So although other circumstances had led him to hate stuff like pacts and vows, he now knew that promises were the one thing that he should try to maintain no matter what. In any case, it was the news of Subaru being able to complete the trial that led Ryuzu to act. But what was most important to notice here was how exactly Ryuzu had referred to herself. She had sworn upon Subaru's promise under the name of Ryuzu Shima, a different name from the Ryuzu we initially met after the trial. If you remember, that one had referred to herself as Ryuzu Bilma. It was a very subtle change that you probably wouldn't have noticed if you weren't paying close attention to the anime. Now, Garfiel's suspicions of Subaru being part of the witch cult wasn't just because of the witch's scent emitting from his body. Although it was rare, Garfiel did know of other normal people who possessed a level of miasma similar to Subaru's. So that alone wasn't enough to make him act the way that he did. What was the way that Subaru said he wanted to take the trial. Subaru was saying that everything was all for the sake of Amelia. Doing the trial in her place was something that he simply felt was best for her. At least that's what he was trying to say anyway. But it was as he said these words that not an ounce of concern could be found. Garfiel found everything Subaru was saying to be nothing but empty. devoid of emotion just like his face when he left the tomb. The calm demeanor that Otto had previously called him out on had now proven to be the very thing that caused Garfiel to take action against him. Ever since leaving the tomb, Subaru's lack of emotion had been the sole reason for every change in this loop. And with the way he was now, Garfiel saw no difference between Subaru and Roswaal. They both spoke with words that were meant to show compassion for others, but neither showed any interest in anything but themselves. It was this plus the lingering scent of the witch that led Garfiel to the conclusion that Subaru couldn't be trusted. It also now made sense of why Garfiel's attitude changed with every loop. You see, every time Subaru returns by death, the density of miasma being emitted from his body increases even further. So, because the miasma was at its thinnest during the first loop, Garfiel was more inclined to be accepting of Subaru taking the trial. But it's because that miasma grew with every time he died that the level of distrust that Garfiel had towards Subaru increased as well, resulting in those significant changes of behavior that Subaru found to be odd. It was also likely what happened with Rem back when he was first starting out at the mansion. The difference with her though was that she was a bit better when it came to maintaining her composure. As for Garfiel, it was clear that Subaru's relationship with him was only going to get worse the more times he died. So this just added a brand new layer of complexity to the entire situation. If Garfiel's level of hostility increased with every time he returned by death, then it would eventually get to the point where imprisonment wouldn't even be an option. Instant death was going to be the most likely outcome, making this yet another obstacle to add to the ever-expanding list of them. I mean, altogether we now had Amelia dealing with the trial, Roswaal being absolutely useless, Puck being unresponsive, Elsa and the mystery beast tamer attacking the mansion, Frederica's manipulation, Petra getting involved when she doesn't have to, Rem's eternal sleep, and finally Beatrice's association with the gospel. All of which Subaru had no idea how he was going to approach, especially now that he was stuck in this prison. While left alone in the darkness and silence, numerous emotions swirled as Subaru tried to figure out a solution. Various images of people began to emerge in his head, and with each one, so too came a different emotion. There was his love for Amelia, then distrust for Roswaal, remorse for Beatrice, then anger for Garfiel. But most importantly, there was his hatred for Elsa. Her situation was the one that was the most pressing. Since evacuation was no longer a possible option, that meant that Subaru needed to find a way to beat her. But Elsa and the Beast Tamer were opponents that Subaru, Ram, and Frederica wouldn't be able to take on alone. More combat power would definitely be needed if he was going to beat them in a fight. But the only 3 people who were capable of stepping in were unavailable due to their own circumstances. It was a situation to which no matter how much thought was given, no solution could be found. So eventually those thoughts ended up subsiding, only to be replaced by the grim memories of everyone who's ever died due to his own incompetence. But when those thoughts of regret subsided as well, what remained was a feeling of isolation that would go to make Subaru's imprisonment one of his worst experiences ever. The loneliness that came from being confined in this darkness and isolation made Subaru yearn for death much like how he did the last time. He couldn't help but imagine all the ways in which he could try to end his life, all because of the excruciating pain that came from being helpless and alone. Although he did have his caretaker, they would never actually say a word whenever they came by, and somehow that just went to make Subaru's isolation even worse. It was as if his existence as a person wasn't even being acknowledged. By the time that Otto had arrived to rescue him, Subaru felt as if it had been centuries since he'd heard another person talk. He was so accustomed to only hearing his own breathing and heartbeat that he couldn't even recognize this sound called a voice. Which brings us now to the heartfelt final moments of the episode, all of which was adapted pretty much perfectly. So that was pretty much it for episode 32. As you now know, there was definitely quite a few subtle things worth taking note of here. So hopefully you enjoyed gaining more context behind these riveting episodes of ReZero. And if you did, then feel free to leave a like or comment so that you can help the video to do better. Anyway, this weekend I'm planning another Isekai Quartet Easter egg video, so be sure to check out the channel on Sunday or Monday for when that video drops. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So until next time, ciao!